Yeah.
All right, so welcome everybody to this first seminar of the MIDIB Migration Diversity in the British and Irish Isles series of the autumn of 2021. Welcome to all the people that are familiar faces already in this seminar series, and welcome to everyone who's new and that we don't know yet, or with whom we're not so familiar with. Welcome to everybody. We're happy to see all of you. Just one very brief word to remind everyone what this seminar, even though many of you do know already. So it's the central activity of a research network that Vincent and I started organizing about a year ago, which is about very broad themes related to immigration and cultural diversity in the UK, as well as in the Republic of Ireland, looking also, and that's very important to us, specifically at Northern Irish, Welsh, Scottish, and English themes and issues related to migration and diversity. And so just to introduce ourselves briefly, for those who don't know us very well yet, Vincent Latour, whom you can probably see on the screen, is Professor of British Studies at the University of Toulouse, Jean Jaurès, and I am Romain Garbaille, also a Professor of British Studies, and I'm at the Sorbonne Nouvelle. For the first session of this series, which is program you can see on our blog. So I think we'll post the address of the blog on the chat. But for the first session today, we're very pleased to have one of my own colleagues in Paris at the Université Sorbonne Nouvelle, Dr. Yann Beliard, who took the great initiative of organizing and Laura Tabili from the University of Arizona to speak about some of her recent work, and which I think is very important to us because it brings it's one of the few presentations that we've had so far which deals with diversity and immigration in the UK in a slightly more historical approach than what we've been doing so far, which has been very focused on politics or contemporary cultures. So Yann, thank you so much for organizing this event with Laura, and I'm going to let you introduce Laura in today's session. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Romain, and thank you, Vincent, for this invitation. We're really delighted to welcome Professor Laura Tabili today. It's really great to have you with us. Laura Tabili teaches modern European history at the University of Arizona in Tucson. So she's actually speaking from there, meaning it's 5 o'clock over here in France, but it's 8 o'clock in the morning over there in North America. So Laura, we are very, very grateful for you agreeing to give a paper so early, quite a challenge. So your paper today is entitled Transients and Settlers in Britain's Multicultural Ports, 1919-1941. So this is a continuation of the work that you've been doing for over 20 years now on the topic of colonial workers in metropolitan Britain. And I guess some of the people attending today's webinar are probably familiar with your work. And if they're not yet, well, they should be, because it's a very important work indeed. So Laura Tabili is the author of two major books on the topic. First, We Ask for British Justice, British Workers and Racial Difference in Late Imperial Britain. This was published in 1994 by Cornell University Press. And I've got the book here, if I can show it to my computer. So here is the cover. And the book focused in particular on colonial sailors in interwar Britain and how the state in the 1920s turned so many of them into aliens, whereas they had enjoyed the status of citizen until then. So a fascinating period. And since then, Laura Tabili has published another book entitled Global Migrants, Local Culture, Natives and Newcomers in Provincial England, 1841-1939, published this time by Palgrave Macmillan. A study of the integration of migrants from the colonies in and around South Shields, to be quite precise, in Northumberland. Of course, Laura has published widely on the subject, both in reviews, in edited volumes. So it's a real privilege to have her with us today and to learn about her work in progress. So Laura, over to you, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much, my esteemed colleague Yann, for putting me in touch with the network, and thank you all, Vincent, Rowan, and all new colleagues. It's such an honor to be invited, and I apologize for the harsh light which enables me to read my paper. I apologize for not giving the paper in French, but you really wouldn't want me to. And I also apologize because my speech is a little slurred in the morning as I have low blood sugar, but that should abate. And I thank you again, everyone, for coming. Those who attended my paper in 2016 and that Yann kindly invited me, well, maybe just made you know I'm still working on the same project. It's not done yet. And the paper today is a part of a chapter that I'm fighting with and therefore would welcome feedback about, attempting to reconstruct how mobile mariners or sailors got stuck in Britain, right? Ended up settling down in Britain, a minority of them, of course. Without further ado, I'll begin, and I welcome any and all feedback. So in the mid-1890s, Richard, and I have pictures, and so I will share those.
Yes, you may.
Okay, yeah, good. In the mid-1890s, can you see them?
No.
Oh, not yet, okay. You know, I do this every day when I teach, and somehow. Okay, there we are. Can you see them now?
Yes.
We see it start, you're sharing. Yes, yes, that's it.
Good. Okay, that's great. So really, it's Richard Woodfield we want to see. Okay, in the mid-1890s, Richard Woodfield, who was then a boy of 12 or 14, stowed away on a schooner, Gladstone, which he found in Kingstown Harbor, St. Vincent in the Caribbean, right? After a year in Jacksonville, Florida, Woodfield sailed for Liverpool on the bark Margaret Mitchell, taking a permanent position in 1909 with the Liverpool-based Cunard Company. Around 1900, a volcanic eruption in St. Vincent had severed Woodfield's communication with relatives in the Caribbean. And of course, that's the same volcano that just erupted about 6 months ago again. Perhaps losing his original family stimulated Woodfield's efforts to establish a new family in Britain, for by 1930, he had married, residing with his wife Mary at 385 Hawthorne Road, Liverpool, which, by the way, is not in Toxteth, which is historically thought to be the only place that people of color lived, right, in Liverpool. By then, Richard had lived in England for 31 of his 46 years, most of his life, right, working for Cunard. Richard Woodfield's story contradicts the idea that colonized people in interwar Britain were invariably rootless transients, generally sailors or some kind of other marginal person. It's true that many colonized seafarers apparently circulated between European, British, colonial, and other ports, residing principally in the homosocial and temporary milieu of compatriot boarding houses. This work and residence pattern, of course, offered minimal contact with native Britons. Others, like Richard Woodfield, however, settled in Britain, marrying or residing with British natives and taking part in British society, gradually integrating into British society. This paper's purpose then is to assemble and analyze evidence about colonized settlers who entered into relationships with native Britons and integrated to varying degrees into British localities. Two critical variables apparently distinguish settlers from transients: possessing capital enough to become the proprietor of a boarding house, a cafe, or another enterprise ashore, or marrying a local woman, thereby gaining access to native social networks, native British social networks. Some men apparently arrived fully intending to leave seafaring and pursue occupations ashore, principally petty capitalism like peddling. Less foreseeably, though, marriage with a local woman could also precipitate a man's transition from transient to settler, as in other migrant populations. Right? Mixed couples, in turn, formed nodes around which migrant networks and communities coalesced, sources of stability and continuity. While most colonized seafarers apparently remained temporary residents of the ports, others became recognized by native Britons as sober and industrious citizens of their communities. And those are quotes, right? So where do we find such information? Due to the frustrations of seeking evidence about colonized people in conventional colorblind historical sources, scholars have often relied on documentation about well-publicized racial or cultural conflicts that have rendered otherwise hidden migrants visible. For instance, the race riots in 1919. Examples include newspaper accounts or police records of riots or other confrontations. Seeking alternative sources to yield a better sense of daily life, as I'm a social historian, right? I've analyzed hundreds of application files for a credential called the Special Certificate of Nationality and Identity. This second-class passport allowed a colonized man to live in Britain and work in British ships, profiting both industry and empire, but withholding from him the full prerogatives of British identity. From the 1920s onward, men who had long lived and worked in Britain, like Richard Woodfield, had to apply for these special certificates in order to continue to practice their profession, right? Of approximately 1,800 such applications that apparently once existed, documentation for about 300 survives. At least that's what I found, 300, spanning the late 1920s to the mid 1930s. The process for getting this credential generated useful documentation about the hundreds of men who applied for it. First, a man seeking a certificate sent an application to the High Commissioner for India, protector of Indian subjects in Britain, or to the Colonial Office responsible for other colonies. And Britain had a chaotic imperial structure, so they didn't even have one ministry responsible for all colonial subjects, which some of you probably know. And this is what the application looked like. This is a fellow called Ali Abdul, who we'll hear from later in the talk. And this is his application, right? He sends the application in this case, to the High Commissioner for India. The High Commissioner of the Colonial Office wrote to the man's place of origin to verify the claims in the application. Colonial officials often needed to interview people in remote villages, showing them the man's photograph, which we have here. If satisfied as to the bona fides of the application, the High Commission or the Colonial Office sent the certificate back to the Home Office, who forwarded it to local police. Police, in turn, called the man in, filled in his physical description, got his signature or thumbprint, and here we have the thumbprint, and issued him the certificate. And then this original application was returned back to the Home Office, and eventually, usually this should have gone to the India office, but I'm lucky that it remained in Home Office files. This process could take weeks or months, during which the man could be stranded, unable to work, or alternatively hard for the police to track down if he was at sea. So this is a very abusive process, but of course it's good for the researcher because it yields a wealth of information about men's mobility, occupations, networks, yielding not only information about individual men, but also allowing partial reconstruction of relations within communities of colonized people and between colonized people and native Britons. The resultant data permit insights into colonized migrants' experiences and institutions in Britain and how they articulated with global and imperial migration, as well as British society. Now, it's very important to remember this sample skews to seafarers because it's a credential that seafarers applied for in order to keep on being seafarers. On the other hand, there's a bit of mission creep, and I'll talk about that later. By the 1930s, men who were obviously not seafarers were applying for this because it was the only credential they could get to legitimize their presence in Britain. But for the most part, these guys were sailors. Because of that, it slights some major categories of employment that colonized people also pursued in Britain, including ayahs or nannies, so there are no women in this sample, sadly, entertainers, and the substantial settlement of steel workers. That's David Holland has found in interwar Sheffield, and he's also documented a very extensive network of peddlers, South Asian peddlers, who covered much of the Midlands and the North, and actually articulated with London. So there's a few peddlers in my sample, but really they're mainly seafarers. On the other hand, I think that the sample also is a fair representation of the diversity of employment in Britain. And if you go back to the 18th century, Norma Myers investigated London's population of color in the Napoleonic period, and she found a similar range of occupations, entitling one chapter Servant, Sailor, Soldier, Tailor, Beggarman. So distinguishing transients from settlers in these data proves a challenge because men's private lives remained hidden. Police and other authorities didn't interest themselves in men's personal affairs unless they thought there was something wrong, right? Something fishy. So they frowned on boarding house keepers, and they frowned on married men and interracial couples, married couples alike, because these institutions formed nodes of resistance, offering friction against maritime employers' practice of churning their labor force to keep them mobile, disunited, and vulnerable. Unsubstantiated allegations about boarding house keepers' corrupt practices complemented similar panic about alleged cultural and racial pollution resulting from intermarriage. So wives and families' presence proved largely unwelcome to the authorities, and it's only documented if they interfered with state agendas. Glimpses must thus be filtered through official disapproval and outright hostility. Further, only a minority of cases reveal personal relations with native Britons. I've got 300 cases, but I only have a couple dozen where I really know very much about the man's personal life. Colonized seafarers' resistance to forming attachments in Britain might stem from pre-existing family ties that also seldom surfaced in the record. Many supported relatives and wives and children in their places of origin, right? Reinforcing their intention to return. Haile Muhammad, for example, first came to Britain in 1906, for example. He lived in Cardiff between 1931 and 1936, yet he had a wife, 2 sons and a daughter in his home village of Bir Ahmed, 25 miles from Aden, right, whom he had visited as recently as 1930. So he was essentially living in exile to support his family. Like Haile Muhammad, Muhammad Ahmed had served as a ship's fireman for decades from his arrival in Britain in 1912 into the 1930s. And I want you to notice many of these men had arrived, like Richard Woodfield, before the First World War. From 1912 to the 1930s, yet Haile Muhammad Ahmed too had a wife, Saida, and a daughter in his home village of Al Fagra near Aden, and had spent about 18 months there in the 1920s. Many other men appearing rootless in the record, transient, right, may have maintained families in the colonies or elsewhere. Such men harbored no ambition to settle in Britain, but rather endured years away from home to provide for their families. Such appeared Hassan Ahmed, who had served in British ships during the Great War between July 1916 and January 1917. Only in 1923, after a 6-year lapse, Ahmed left his wife and 6 children in Aden, perhaps reluctantly, returning to sea in order to support them. Another glimpse of transoceanic family ties appeared when Gul Hussein Shah's mother and brothers contacted the High Commissioner in autumn 1931, requesting that he return home to Northwest Frontier Province in South Asia. Upon Gul Hussein Shah's return from his current voyage, police in Bristol relayed the entreaty, whereby he states that he will probably do so in the near future. The personal circumstances of many other long-serving mariners remain obscure, right? Simply because insufficient information survives. But these examples suggest reasons why men with extensive service in British ships remained focused on families and their places of origin rather than settling in Britain. In contrast, other men apparently used sea voyages as a means of hidden migration, simultaneously ridding themselves of unwanted elements of personal identity or circumstance. A fellow called Samuel Ogunbiyi worked for an engineering firm in Bolton, Lancashire in the 1920s. He was actually the nephew of an archdeacon and came from a prominent Lagos family. He'd served briefly at sea where, and I'm quoting here, owing to the difficulty of pronouncing his name, he had been called Ko, unquote, portending perhaps his shift of affiliation from Africa to Britain. Abdullah Karim similarly adopted the alias King instead of Karim, while serving in British ships on European articles of agreement, rather than the disadvantaged terms most colonized seafarers were forced into. Once in Britain, so these guys are kind of, I call them shapeshifters because they're kind of acclimatizing themselves to British culture. Once in Britain, colonized seafarers faced choices about their relations with native Britons. Unlike the stranded Ayaz seafarers and other colonized people found in Victorian Britain, by the 20th century, most arrived voluntarily and remained deliberately. Apart from students or skilled men, they continued seafaring or sought and found work in mines, factories, farming, peddling, or petty trade. Still, simply remaining ashore in Britain could not ensure colonized men's integration. Only interdependence and daily interaction can forge bonds and degrade social barriers. Scholarship shows native British couples in interwar Sheffield, and I'm drawing on David Holland's work again, housed migrants of colonial origin who shared the husband's occupations as steelworkers. In other words, that's how they met, right? Several applicants in my sample similarly resided with apparently British householders. Louis Olivier Mahone, for example, born in Port Louis, Mauritius, had lived in Britain since 1906. Unlike many seafarers, by 1932, Mahone had apparently made the transition into Welsh daily life and community, residing not in a boarding house, but with a landlady, Mrs. Green, in the Clune Valley near Swansea. Muhammad Ali resided in Swansea also with a Mrs. Lewis, a Kashmiri peddler, there are a lot of Muhammad Alis in my sample. Another Muhammad Ali who was from Kashmir resided with a Mrs. Black in Falkirk, Scotland, while his compatriot Ghulam Rasul stayed only intermittently in Scotland, but always with the same apparently Scottish householder, Carmichael. Some, like Kashmiri peddler Muhammad Zaman, apparently used residence with a native as a stepping stone to absorption into the British labor force. Shortly after reporting his address care of another Mrs. Lewis in Duncan Street, Kirkcaldy, Muhammad Zaman simply disappeared from official view. Another long-term resident, Muhammad Amin, arrived in Britain from Mirpur after the First World War and had never returned to sea. Living continuously in Greenock, the port of Glasgow, by 1933, Amin resided care of someone called Ritchie, again, apparently a native Scot. Further evidence of integration into Scottish society, Amin had anglicized his name to Samuel. For, and I'm quoting, as he was a British subject, it would be easier for anyone to read in this country, unquote. Perhaps sensitive to a degree of cultural incomprehension, he added, and I'm quoting, no one here understood the meaning of Muhammad, unquote. This poignant remark betrayed the loss of or suppression of identity, possibly demanded as the price of integration. So by the 1920s, the British state cast its net ever wider. This credential began in the whole process of bothering men who had long lived in Britain over Yemeni protected persons who the British state was trying to redefine, as Yann told us, as not British. But by the 1930s and even the 1920s, other colonial subjects were starting to be caught in the net. Differences nonetheless emerge among men of different origins, particularly those who arrived earlier rather than later. Many men from the Caribbean, like Richard Woodfield, apparently became established in Britain before the First World War, appearing almost universally resident in their own homes rather than boarding houses or lodgings. Two major settlements appeared in Canning Town, East London, and in Southampton, the port of embarkation for the Atlantic trade. And an example of that is John McFarlane, who had left Kingston, Jamaica for Southampton in 1893 at the age of 18. By August 1932, he'd resided in Britain and worked steadily with the Royal Mail Company for 34 years, residing at 30 Northam Street in Southampton. Even the Home Office admitted, and I'm quoting again, it seems rather late in the day for this man to be in need of evidence of his national status, unquote. In fact, such long settled men entered the historical record only due to the excessive zeal of port officials whose original purview encompassed genuine transients. And this was a case of bureaucratic mission creep, right? Of Ferdinand Nathaniel Hill and 3 other Barbadians in Southampton, Home Office staff commented, and I'm quoting, "It was not really intended to bring in men of the type of these 4 men apparently long established in the UK," unquote. Not that they did anything about putting a stop to it, by the way. Not only did such men apparently live in their own homes, likely married, although I can't find that out until I can go to Southampton, but those in Southampton resided throughout the town. In other words, not in some kind of a ghetto like Toxteth and Liverpool or Bute Town and Cardiff. Longtime residents such as these, particularly if they no longer lived in a port, often remained invisible to the authorities, thus the record. Punjabi Samuel Muradin, for example, left India before 1914, only surfacing when he and his wife registered under the Aliens Order 1920, when it was immediate, right after it was promulgated. By 1930, they resided in Brooks Bar, Manchester, which is there's no indication surviving that Samuel actually continued to go to sea. Most applicants for certificates, in contrast, continue to live in seaports, affording ready access to employment, while residents elsewhere suggested nominal commitment to seafaring or efforts to abandon it for more secure and pleasant work. And of course, once a man is married, he might well want to try to find a job that allows him to sleep in his own bed at night. And as Richard Woodfield's case illustrated, a key variable in men's transition from sojourner or transient to settler often proved marriage and family formation. And by the way, if I'm going over time, please tell me I can hurry or throw something overboard. So marriage is the thing that often precipitated a man settling down. Documented Black or interracial families in Britain date from at least the 18th century and probably go back much before that, right? Throughout the centuries, a relative scarcity of women of like origin led many colonized men to seek wives and partners from local populations, which is also very common to migrants, right? In general. British women proved on the whole notoriously more sympathetic and receptive than British men to colonized men, right? Sierra Leone-born Liverpudlian Ernest Mark was twice rescued from hostile crowds in 1919 by local women, including factory women who rushed at the mob screaming madly. Of 285 West African and Afro-Caribbean men surveyed in Liverpool in 1919, 40 were married, most to British women. Of the remaining wives described as the term colored, which is what they used at the time, all but 3 lived in Sierra Leone, Barbados, Canada, or Philadelphia. In other words, these men had wives in Africa or the Caribbean or Canada or the United States. Only 3 actually lived with their husbands in Liverpool, and one of these had been born there. So 3 women of color living in Liverpool in 1919, married to men who were menaced by racist crowds. So marriage proved the most obvious life-altering decision, prompting men to shift allegiance from their place of origin to Britain. Whether cruise seafarers in Liverpool married or simply cohabited with common law wives, for example, indicated their intention to settle in Britain permanently or to maintain affiliations with West Africa. Yemenis and especially Somalis' inability to stabilize their residence in Britain by getting the proper documentation appears to have depressed their marriage rates below those of other migrants. And here we go back to Ali Abdul. The story of Nur Ali Abdul and his father Ali Tabit illustrated the processes whereby men formed families in Britain that shifted their affiliation from their place of origin to Britain. Tabit arrived in Cardiff from Aden in 1914. By the 1930s, he was married with 8 children born in South Shields. In 1933, his sole son born in Aden, that's this young man here, sought to regularize his status in Britain in order to work legally. The younger man stated he felt compelled to come to England to assist his father in any way possible to provide his younger siblings with food and lodgings, right? In July, Nouri Ali Abdul traveled to London to see what you, that is the Home Office, can do for me, again citing the need to help support his father's English family. I'm quoting, "He has 8 children, all underage. It takes him all his time to get food for them. I came to England to help him bring up my brothers and sisters," unquote. And then his father explained, "He is the only son I had in my country, so I thought he would come here and get a job so as to help me and his little brothers." Time and distance had attenuated the father's ties to Aden. "It is out of my memory now to remember anyone in my country owing to my long absence from there. His son has gotten no one in Aden, only me and Shields." So that's a really vivid example, I think, or illustration of that transition. Marriage and family formation similarly signaled Ullah Rashid's change in orientation from sojourning to settling. Born in Calcutta in 1895, Ullah Rashid arrived in Britain in June 1925 as a marine fireman, but left the sea 3 years later, becoming a peddler and later opening a boarding house for peddlers at 16 Elder Street in East London. The police constable and hostile police constable, brace yourself for some kind of mean language here. PCW Bateson in 1934, and I'm quoting, "For some 5 or 6 years, he has cohabited with a white girl, British born, by whom he has 2 illegitimate children. The girl also has 2 other children, older, whose father is another colored man. Other lodgers included 2 other white girls, both living with colored men to whom they are most likely not married," unquote. While PC Bateson ventured further unflattering observations about Ullah Rashid, his transition from seafaring to shore-based occupations clearly correlated to forming a relationship and fathering children. His house, moreover, provided a safe haven for mixed couples and their children, one cluster in a growing community of South Asians in London, gradually spreading all over the East End and elsewhere. That's a quote too. This is unsurprising, as marriage and the domestic and reproductive services women provided proved critical in sustaining migrant men and the industries they served. Here we have David Hilton Payne, who's from Barbados. Oh, I'm sorry. Marriage, this is not, first I need to talk about Ernest Molyneux, who married a local woman in the Welsh port of Swansea. By 1931, had 3 children. A local police detective praised Molyneux, whom he had known for years, as a sober and industrious citizen and a very respectable citizen. And this was part of a testing to get the guy his papers, right? David Hilton Payne, on the other hand, born in Roseau, Dominica in 1894, similarly lived with his wife in Weston-super-Mare, Somerset, which is not a seagoing port, right? Suggesting that marriage may have facilitated his move out of Sailor Town and integration into provincial society. Further, Payne's wife dealt with police in April 1930 when they came calling, promising, I'm quoting, to report to the police immediately she receives any definite information from her husband, who is then at sea. Another longtime resident of Hull, Claude Drayton Gittins, arrived in Britain from Barbados in 1902. By the 1930s, he was both taking part in the substantial community of Caribbean and African origin, but lived with his wife and children in a leafy neighborhood of Hull, which was distant from the actual port where the boarding houses were. So scholars have documented a lot how locally born wives provided practical support as their husbands or consorts navigated British society and law. Edwardian boarding housekeepers benefited from literate British wives who acted as court interpreters, like Samuel Dean, former seafarer Galal Dean Bascon, originally from Northwest Frontier Province, had left maritime labor altogether in 1929, settled in Liverpool, and by 1932 operated a refreshment house, soon to be licensed as a boarding house in Park Lane, which is in Toxteth, or near Toxteth anyway. Illustrating the advantages of marrying a local woman, Galaldine's wife, like Mrs. Payne, dealt with the police when they called. Several other men clearly relied on their wife's support in commercial endeavors. After Dar Hassan received his overcoat from a thrift street boarding house, its owner, Abdullah Faid, instructed him to return the key to the missus, as he called her, his locally born wife, Margaret. Mrs. Olive Suleiman, or Solomon, a Welsh woman from the valleys, operated Butte Town's Cairo Cafe with her Yemeni husband, Ali, for 38 years. Yusuf Chuduri, who is from Birmingham, recalled illiterate compatriots whose businesses in post-war Birmingham failed after their British wives died. Women also independently operated cafes, brothels, clubs, and boarding houses in the port areas. Women's vital role in Britain's multicultural ports was reflected in their frequent inclusion in compatriot self-help or confessional organizations. A survival strategy for men disadvantaged by language and other barriers, marriage also gave men access to native kin and social networks and support systems, what Diane Frost has called dual citizenship. Wives supported, particularly proved critical for men from Yemen, Somalia, and South Asia, who are also impeded by language barriers, right? Anthropologist Sidney Collins in the 1950s, and I'm quoting, observed the relief and relaxation that is shown by an Arab when his wife enters into a conversation with an English speaker on his behalf. Men derived a sense of security from women who translated or otherwise assisted them in negotiating the new milieu. Ali Tabit, for instance, did not write his letters to the Home Office himself, but simply put his mark on them. Quite possibly it was his wife who served as scribe. Now, I want to talk about Winifred Ghani, who actively advocated on behalf of her husband, Abdul Ghani, facilitating his integration. Originally from Jhelum, Punjab, Abdul Ghani settled in Fleetwood, Lancashire, working for 10 years as a ship's engineer on local steam trawlers. In May 1930, he married Winifred Jones, a barmaid in the Railway Hotel Blackpool. In doing so, Abdul Ghani acquired a social network composed of native Britons who actively promoted his incorporation into British society. I'm quoting, his wife and her friends urged upon him the necessity to establish his position as a British subject, unquote. Abdul Ghani duly reported to local authorities, who instead registered him as an alien. Offended by this turn of events, in October 1930, Winifred wrote first to the India office and then to the Home Office. And I'm quoting here from, this is Abdul's letter. But clearly you can see Winifred wrote it for him, right? So, but this is Winifred's letter. So Abdul wrote first, and getting no response, Winifred writes again. Where it is. Will you please advise us what to do, as my husband is a British subject and it was a mistake? How can we get rid of having to report every time we have a removal, because we don't think it is necessary to be checked every month? So this is a really good illustration of the assistance that wives gave to their husbands, because yeah, this actually purported to come from Ali Abdul, but obviously it's the same handwriting as his wife. While Winifred Ghani and Mrs. Bascon willingly and actively supported their husbands, the mere prospect of a wife enabled Razibullah to elude the authorities by pretending he was married. I think I'm going to skip that example if we're short of time, and go on to Mrs. Mary Fazl. But basically, this guy tries to bluff the authorities to think that he's married, because if a man is married, he can establish domicile in Britain. Once having established domicile, he can collect relief, and therefore he can't be, it's very difficult to deport him. But I'm going to go on to Mary Fazl. To the women involved, such a marriage brought risks as well as rewards. Fazl, like Winifred Ghani, Mary Fazl corresponded repeatedly with the India office after her husband became subject to police harassment. Married with 3 children, Fazl Muhammad was registered as an alien in September 1925, immediately after the colored alien seaman order came into play. He had identity documents which the police confiscated, and this was a common practice. Mrs. Fazl's concerns extended not only to her husband of 8 years, but herself and their children. Fazl Muhammad was registered as an alien. And I'm quoting, should anything happen to him in a foreign port, his rights as a Britisher would be jeopardized, and consequently my own and our children's. These concerns were not ill-founded. Some bright spark in the London Metropolitan Police proposed, in fact, registering as aliens the wives of men who were registered as colored alien seamen, most of whom, like Mrs. Fazl's husband, were in fact undocumented British subjects. For, as he pointed out, legally, technically, a wife takes the nationality of her husband, which actually was true. After the local passport office refused to process Fazl Muhammad's passport application, Mrs. Fazl wrote again, and the outcome of his case actually remains unknown. I couldn't figure out whether he ever got what he was entitled to. In addition to the concerns Mrs. Fazl raised, a woman who transgressed imperial barriers to marry or consort with a colonized man risked an array of penalties, from ostracism by her family and community to peril of separation by the state itself. During the repatriation campaigns of 1919 and their early 20s, wives who wished to accompany their unemployed husbands to Africa or the Caribbean were discouraged and even prevented or excluded. Not only were British wives repeatedly blocked from accompanying their husbands to British colonies, but wives in the colonies were barred from joining their husbands in Britain. For instance, in February 1929, the Chief Constable of Cardiff advised the Colonial Office that the wife of Abu Kiravad, and I'm quoted, should not be allowed to come to this country from Somalia. While causing great heartache and mischief, however, control remained aspirational, as we say nowadays. Several British wives I'm sorry.
No, nothing, sorry. Which is
several British
myself, how interesting that was. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
So yes, Several British wives indeed did travel to their husbands with West Africa in after the riots in 1919. Mabel Khan traveled with her husband to India in 1929, but returned due to not getting along with the climate. And even the white, a wife described as white in the record, wife of West African Tom Tier, lived in Sierra Leone in 1919. Indeed, researchers found colonial-born wives in Liverpool in 1919, Somali and Egyptian wives in Cardiff, and women of Malay and West African origin in Stepney in the 1940s. Repudiating those who portrayed these populations as recent, Liverpool researcher David Craddock Jones in 1939 found 10 locally born women of mixed heritage over the age of 25, 15 aged 25 to 35, 9 aged 35 to 45, and 6 over 45 years old, which meant many of them had arrived before the First World War, women of colonial origin, indicating a long-standing and stable community. So you'll be happy to know I'm about to conclude. Although subject to intense pressure by hostile and prurient outsiders, interwar marriages, families, and communities established foundations for contemporary Britain's multiracial and multicultural society. Through the vagaries of policy, the state and even the union continued to distinguish between men they considered transient, whom they felt free to exclude, and a man who, and I'm quoting, who can prove he has a home of his own in this country, unquote, normally because he was married. This distinction was shared by Caroline Adams's informants in a wonderful oral history called Across 7 Seas and 13 Rivers, which is oral histories with Bengali migrants that were done in the 90s. Her informants disapproved of Betiwalas, as they called them, who consorted with British women. But if they were a Shadiwala, that is, they married and settled down respectably with a British woman, that was completely different, right? Particularly if the wife converted to Islam, and many of these wives did. South Asians, West Africans, Somalis, Yemenis, and others thus depended not only on other migrants for lodging, work, negotiation with authority, and assistance when unemployed, as many of them did through a network of compatriot boarding houses, but they also relied on native Britons, particularly wives, partners, and landladies. Visible dockside communities thus appear the tip of a much larger iceberg of residents of colonial origin dispersed throughout the ports and beyond them, from Stokes Croft to Brooks Bar. In turn, the cases analyzed here represent a sliver of evidence demanding substantial further research. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. Yann, do you want to take questions, or if you want to start with questions, perhaps? Or
yes, I'm happy to begin.
Yes.
Well, first, thank you very much, Laura, for a very stimulating paper. I've been invited by Romain and Vincent to introduce the Q&A with a few comments and questions of my own. So I'll try not to be too long. Although there are, of course, 100 questions I'd like to ask, but maybe just three points so that everybody has time to ask their own questions. My first remark is a very simple one. It's in many ways a very moving paper that you've just given. I mean, it's not just thought-provoking. Very often it's poignant. From each of the individual stories that you've retrieved from the archives, from the Colonial Office papers, from the Home Office papers, I mean, we could build works of fiction, short stories, novels, TV series, etc., because it's so full of human feeling. I mean, of course, there's love and solidarity, there's grief, there's nostalgia, there's ambition, there's hope, and so on. So I was wondering, whether you've resorted to, or whether you were thinking of resorting to, the tools devised or used by historians in the field of the history of emotions, because this seems to be an expanding field at the moment. So I was wondering whether there was anything there that you could find handy. But maybe this is a more general question for people in the webinar tonight, wondering whether the history of emotions has got anything to bring to migration studies or diasporic studies more generally. My second point is more factual. You stress the variety of origins of the colonial sailors that you come across settling in Britain, some coming from the West Indies, East Africa, West Africa, the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, and so on and so forth. And you discuss their interactions with British society. I was wondering also about the interactions between those seafarers and sailors, wondering whether, coming from such diverse origins and with all of the linguistic and national and religious barriers one can imagine, whether we can speak of a cosmopolitan community of seafarers at all, or whether there were in fact within the community of seafarers a juxtaposition of communities which were maybe at best juxtaposed and indifferent to each other, or in the worst of cases, maybe sometimes hostile. I mean, racism sometimes is not just between metropolitan society and colonial workers, but it can also be between different groups of migrants. So that was my second point. And my third and final comment, well, it's both an observation and an interrogation. I like the way you explain that race relations in Britain and possibly in any country, they can't be understood fully by just concentrating on moments of clash and conflict. Of course, that's what's most visible in the press, sometimes in the archives. And of course, as a labor historian, I could easily relate to the point you were making, because it's very tempting to study only strikes, for example, or waves of strikes, because they're almost naturally in the foreground. But of course, you can't understand those moments of eruption and explosion without examining the much longer periods where nothing much seems to happen, and yet so much is happening beneath the surface. And of course, that's what you try to do. And of course, I think that's a very interesting point you were making. And coming to my interrogation, I mean, your emphasis here in your paper is obviously on the integration of colonial workers, on the specific role of British women. I mean, this is a fascinating aspect of your talk, the role of women and marriage in the process. And all of this seems to me as being at odds with a certain tendency in the historiography right now, probably not so recent, but historians who insisted much more on the global color bar implemented not just by employers and the states, but historians who've insisted also on how that color bar has sometimes, and maybe often, benefited from the active complicity of the workers themselves and their organizations. So I'm thinking of the works by David Rudiger and his Wages of Whiteness in 1991. Thinking of Jonathan Hislop, South African historian, and his famous article in 1999 on how the imperial working class made itself white. Also thinking of more recently a work by, I think it's two historians from New Zealand, Marilyn Lake and Henry Reynolds, drawing the global color line. Fascinating works, but all insisting on the racism of British workers, maybe to the detriment of other kinds of relationships. And I feel that what your paper shows is that if we look beyond, for example, the official positions of the National Union of Seamen, which was notorious for its xenophobic discourse and praxis, I think you're pointing to areas of everyday life where relationships could be based on forms of sympathy and could be much more egalitarian. So I'd love to have your take on this. And I was wondering whether your empirical findings could, in fact, maybe lead us to build a whole new counter narrative, maybe a more optimistic one than the ones I've just mentioned. Yeah, so that's all to introduce the debate. Laura, I mean, would you rather answer those questions or wait for other questions from the audience?
I'll quickly answer. I hadn't thought about the history of emotions, and I'm eager to hear more about it. Secondly, yes, the question of whether I have another chapter where I looked at the compatriot boarding houses, and some of the boarding houses only there was one guy in South Shields, he only accommodated Yemenis. So it's quite clear that one could be a Yemeni sailor and one could only ever encounter other Yemenis, Yemenis in Cardiff, Yemenis in South Shields. But then there were other boarding houses that were mixed, where it seemed as if the boarding house keepers would accommodate any men of different origins, and obviously the men themselves weren't bothered. Now, it's true that a lot of Yemeni and Somali boarding houses had prayer rooms so that men could observe daily prayers, and you couldn't do that in a mixed boarding, or I don't know whether they did. So yes, there was certainly a degree of segregation. Some scholars have really insisted that there was no contact. I don't think that's true. For one thing, when there were moments of conflict, people of color did band together, and there was the Colonial Defense Organization. There were organizations that where all colonized seafarers came together to resist at the occasion of the riots. 1919, there was another dreadful piece of legislation that excluded non-British, 1935. And once again, it caused I don't know what to call it, because ethnic is such a problematic word, and so is race. But anyway, it caused men of different origins to band together. So I think both were going on briefly. And then third, briefly, yeah, I think there's evidence for both. And certainly there's a huge amount of evidence of racism and of institutionalized racism that is undeniable. But one of the things I think there's not only this, but certainly there's a gender gap. And the idea that the state and the union and even white male workers get to speak for the society and the culture, and that the women who married these men don't get to speak for the society and the culture, I think is a little bit problematic. I think about Simone de Beauvoir saying that women are the enemies of civilization. Obviously, women who are willing to marry in spite of all of this disapproval, why don't, I sort of think, why don't we credit them? And then in the case of, there's certainly evidence that a woman who married a colonized man might be ostracized by her family, usually not permanently, etc. So it's obviously a mixed bag, and the national unions seem hugely problematic, but not atypical. When I wrote that book, people said, how can you criticize the union? Now it's kind of the pendulum swung the other way, and there's an assumption that all unions were racist all the time. But I don't want to, I want to hear from other people. I want to take this whole time.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Laura, for all those insightful remarks. Now, I suppose it's time for other people to raise their hands if they'd like to ask their questions.
Okay, well, I wouldn't mind asking a question if nobody else wants to ask any question. Can I go ahead again? Or, yeah?
Please do, yeah.
Yeah. thank you. So thank you very much for a very, very, very interesting paper. I was very, very impressed by the research that you did. And I also thought, like Yann, that it was particularly, it seems to be a particularly emotional subject. And there's something about Yann's question about the history of emotions, I think, that you're raising, I mean, obviously telling great tales of hardship, of transplantation, exile, and loss, and families recomposed, and new families being born out of migration, and so on. I think it's fascinating. Yeah, there's also a lot of questions that come to mind in many ways, but I was curious about the removal campaigns. I think if memorize the term you used correctly, of the 1921 and 1920, the British authorities tried to deport or remove many of these migrants back to their colonies of origin, and so trying to send them back without the women, if I understood correctly. And so I was curious to understand, well, why exactly they would do that, and also how they were able to do that legally. And because you mentioned something about nationality, but all of that, I'd be curious to know more a bit about how all this worked, because earlier you also mentioned that if at some point the colonial subjects, the men, were able to prove that they had a domiciliation with the wife, then they were out of trouble. They were covered. They couldn't be removed. So how did that work when they tried to have these removal or deportation campaigns?
Yeah, it was tortured, right? In 1919, there were riots, and the worst ones. There were riots in lots of ports over the course of the spring, but the worst ones were in Liverpool and Cardiff in June, and they were so bad that the authorities, and it was because of unemployment after the First World War, but also there were other complicating factors like demobilized soldiers who were stuck in a camp in Cardiff and wanted to go home and so on. And the remedy that the authorities sought was to simply deport all of the colonized sailors back to wherever they came from. They called it repatriation. They didn't call it deportation because they admitted that they were British subjects vaguely, or at least that many of them probably were. And why they thought that they could arbitrarily, they said, we don't have facilities on the ships for women. Not sure what that means, but I can well imagine as a woman. But in addition, the woman would have to consent to her husband going without her, but they would I think they applied techniques of persuasion to get some of these wives to consent to their husbands leaving. Now, did the men stay away? I doubt it. I think many of them probably came back again. Right. The person who wrote the book about that is Jacqueline Jenkinson, wrote a whole book about 1919. So, and also the repatriation campaigns were not very successful because men did have so many ties. The ones who weren't married sometimes owed debts to boarding house keepers if they'd been unemployed and so on. And so they would have a ship, to have with 285 berths, and they'd end up sending, 25 guys. So, but they continued to see repatriation as a remedy. In terms of establishing domicile by being married, this is why I think they had to get the wife's consent. They actually, in short.
Yeah, okay. Thanks a lot. Just one more little question. Could you write in the chat the name of the author that you just mentioned? And also there was an author you mentioned about the oral histories of Bangladeshi women in the 90s. Okay, I was curious to check out the names.
Yann has put Black 1919 into the chat already.
Thank you, Yann. Yeah.
And what is, I don't have the exact title, but I think that will do. It was put out actually by the Tower Hamlets Arts Project, but it's, and then,
What is the author's name? Yes.
Caroline Adams is the person who compiled the oral histories.
Carol
And then
Adamson?
Caroline Adams. Oh, I'm
Adams,
sorry, I didn't
yeah.
send it, did I? Sorry.
Oh,
There it
okay.
is.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Thanks very much. I'll be able to have a look at that. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Right, Vincent, would you like to?
Thanks for a really interesting presentation. I myself used to live in Bristol, and I came across the story of a number of Indians who settled there in the 1920s, 1930s. People from the Indian bourgeoisie were actually notably doctors, and one family in particular, Datta. And the man who played actually a part in the local Labour Party became actually a councillor in the 1930s. And I was wondering whether you'd found evidence of political parties taking an interest in these, these overseas subjects, or these overseas subjects getting involved in the Labour movement or in political parties.
Yes, and again, the person who's done more work on that than I have is Marika Sherwood, who's actually documented some of that. I'll put her. But briefly, yes, the Labour Party, I haven't found very many activists in the Labour Party, but there were certainly Labour activists from South Asia. Why am I drawing a blank? There was a really famous, a couple of really, I'm drawing a blank. So I'll talk about, there was Harry O'Connell and a fellow called Braithwaite, who were organizing sometimes within the National Union of Seamen and sometimes for the TUC Seamen section. And they were communists, CPGB. And Marika Sherwood has written a couple of articles about them. And if I can go back to my records, I'll, and why I'm drawing, there was certainly a really important South Asian guy too, Asian labor organizer. The problem with the Seamen's Union was that they were approached over and over again by colonial unions to affiliate, and they rebuffed them because they had this deal where they got the pension. It's kind of like the United States. They got the pension contributions from colonized sailors, but those sailors weren't able to collect those pensions, and so it subsidized pensions for the white sailors or the British sailors. Darn it, why I can't remember this guy's name, but I'll email it to you later. Oh, great. Yeah, so there were certainly labor organizers, and there were political Shapurji Saklatvala, right, who was first communist and then a labor MP. He was active, and in fact, there were kind of elite that when these moments of conflict occurred, middle-class leaders did step forward. So Rufus Fennell in Liverpool, who was more of a middle-class leader, and there were always amongst the middle class, they always professed to be speaking for working class people, but they didn't always agree. For instance, I just reread a little a debate between I think it was Fennell, who was saying to the guys who the government wanted to deport back to the Caribbean, take the money and go, you know, and then the labor, the guy who actually spoke for the working class guys themselves said, no, don't do that. So they didn't always pull together, but they did sometimes try to represent themselves as spokespeople. And sometimes they, you know, they did do something. But
Thank you.
thank you. I'll send that when I remember it.
Yeah, just having a look at the screen to see if there are any raised hands at all. Don't want to miss any questions.
Well, if I can squeeze in one more question, if I can use
we've got
a lot of our
time.
speakers' time today. I'm just curious about the, what about the wives? Were there any wives from the colonies of origins? What about what we call today family reunification? I mean, I think you alluded to that, you talked about it a little bit, but essentially you focused on the British-born, the native wives, and it seems to me there's a whole new, brings an extra dimension to the subject. And were they welcomed? Were they encouraged by the authorities? Were they also subject to sort of administrative harassment and so on?
I know very little about. I know very little about those women. The fact that they existed at all is a surprise, and a welcome surprise. The authorities did not want them to come to Britain. They were quite heartless about marriages of colonized men, whether they were married to white women. They tried to get them to go back to the colonies without their wives. They wouldn't let the wives go with them. And then the wives from the colonies, yeah, they tried to keep them out, but people are people. And so, a small number of women managed to get in. Now in Liverpool, especially, and by the 40s in Cardiff and Stepney and other places, there were also daughters of mixed heritage. And more was written about them, usually from social entrepreneurs, social workers, saying, oh, these poor girls, they have no prospects, they're going to end up, as prostitutes. But as a matter of fact, especially daughters of Yemenis and Somalis were actually in high demand because they could make a good Muslim home for a Muslim man. So, but I don't even know really any of their names.
That's a really interesting, because I'm much more used to working on contemporary, or let's say post-World War II migrations to Britain. And then in migration studies in the contemporary period, the question of family reunification is a major subject, and it's recurring all the time in academic debates and policy debates. And so it's surprising that around World War I, or let's say the first half of the 20th century, your area, the area you've been talking about today, it doesn't seem to be so visible as a social phenomenon, as a subject of the historiography, whereas we in the contemporary period just see, a lot of migrant workers bringing their families from home, and it continues to this day. Why there was this evolution all throughout the 20th century. I think this puzzling question for me is quite interesting.
Well, one could hypothesize. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
One could hypothesize that the Second World War and the kind of human rights discourse that came out of it.
Yeah.
But I don't know. That's just a hypothesis.
Yeah. Because pre-World War II, I mean, of course, there are these administrative barriers to the settlement of these people from the colonies in Britain, but there was, and you've mentioned it several times, there were British subjects. So they should have been able to travel around as much as they wanted, but obviously, so I guess it's all about rules that make all of the difference, and that's what changed broadly speaking after World War II. I would imagine, yes. And Britain became signatory to international conventions guaranteeing family reunification, I guess.
Well, also in the 1948 Nationality Law, Nationality Act made all colonial subjects British subjects.
Yeah.
And that was for very cynical political reasons.
Yeah.
It changed the discourse. And then, of course, it changed again in the 70s and 80s.
And changed the discourse, yes.
And the law. Yeah.
Actually, a remark about, you talked about the 1940s and the impact of the Second World War. Well, if we think about the attitude of the British government towards women of color during the Second World War, I found actually a document I use for my students. It actually emanates from the War Office, 1943, and this is what he said about the service of women from the Caribbean in particular in the British Armed Forces. It said, whilst we are prepared to accept any European women, we cannot agree to accept colored women for service in this country. You see, so the question of the service of women of color in the British Army seemed to be still a problem in 1943, despite the fact that Britain was fighting, racism and Nazism. It certainly had double standards in terms of, who could serve in the army and in which sort of, capacities. And much could be said about the attitude of the British government towards, Black American soldiers during the war, since they were actually concentrated in separated barracks, and the British actually accepted the, racial discrimination that prevailed in the British Army, in the American Army, then, on their soil. So anyway, that's just to illustrate that.
Well, actually, there was another middle-class organization, the League of Colored Peoples. It was London-based. It was mostly people from the Caribbean, but actually that was all sorts of people belonged to that. I'm trying to think of South Asians and certainly Africans and some famous people like Hastings Banda. And in fact, Eric Hobsbawm wrote the jazz criticism for this periodical. It's called The Keys, and you can probably find it. But the founder of it was Dr. Harold Moody, and he was a physician who lived in Peckham, and he had a lot of children, and a couple of his daughters tried. He was from the Caribbean, but I think his wife was white. He had daughters who wanted to join the women's auxiliary corps, and one of his daughters was kind of a test case about whether they would take a young woman of color, even one who was born and raised in Britain. And she eventually did get in. But that periodical contains a lot of discussion of the hypocrisy of saying you're fighting Hitler because he's a racist, and then, as you said, practicing racism within the war effort, especially at the behest of the Jim Crow American Army. But they, for instance, they didn't have, if it was during the Second World War when they finally let men of color, colonized men be officers. During the First World War, when the Indian Army came to fight in Normandy, they officered them with old retired, they got all the old white guys out of retirement so that they could be officers. So they're real double standards.
Can I just come back to America Sherwood that you were mentioning earlier on, and the question of the relationship of political parties with colonial workers in Britain? Because there's a very interesting article that can be read after the one you mentioned by America Sherwood, one by John Callaghan, all about, the debate being, what was the CPGB, was the Communist Party of Great Britain actually racist or not, and can that explain the failure to organize colonial workers and bring them into either the Communist Party or even just into the unions? And I think John Callaghan makes an interesting case to say that, in fact, it wasn't so much prejudice that stopped communists from succeeding in organizing colonial workers, so much as just lack of forces. The CPGB was not very well implemented in seaports. Those were not the strongholds of a small party. The CPGB in the 20s is a small party. So I think he's got a point here. Not to diminish any of America Sherwood's merits, but it's interesting to read both articles, one after the other. And there's another dimension that I think neither of the articles addresses, and I think it's also important. It's a question of simply the Stalinization of the CPGB, and how from the moment that it embraces popular front policies, so from 1934, 1935 onwards, simply the question of anti-imperialism is left behind, and the priority that was given at one point to trying to address colonial workers simply put on the back burner, because you shouldn't trouble any possible alliance between the USSR and the democratic empire of Britain. And so that's, in fact, colonial workers from 1935 onwards, possibly all the way until 1948, with a small parenthesis between 39 and 41, that they're just no longer part of the CPGB agenda for, let's say, rather cynical reasons of international policies. And the same is true. I mean, it's another topic of the way the Communist Party in the United States related to the question of African-American workers and whether that was a priority or not. Clearly, in the days of Popular Front policies, it wasn't anymore. I mean, that's just a point I wanted to make. It, if you'd like to.
Well, I have a couple of pamphlets by Claudia Jones, who I think was Bristol based, maybe I'm wrong, who was deported from the United States for being a communist and ended her life in Britain. And she was actually from the Caribbean originally. That's why they deported her to Britain. And one of them was very critical of the Second World War. And then the other one was fire up for victory. So it reflected how the Communist Party flipped, basically. Which is, well, they weren't the only ones who flipped.
Oh, yeah, there was a question by Miriam Yacoubi. Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for this presentation. I have a question which may sound really very basic or maybe secondary, but I was wondering about the use of the word settlers in the title of your presentation. And I was just wondering why settlers and not immigrants? I understood that many of them intended to settle there permanently, precisely, which is probably why you use the word settlers. But I think the word immigrants is also used to refer to people who also intended to settle permanently. So, and of course, settlers also refers to British people who settled in the colonies. So is this a deliberate sort of reversal that you wanted to underline?
Yeah. Yes. I've been very I feel like our language is poisoned, by so many terms that you could use that either have implications you don't want to convey, or you need to explain what you mean. You need to define them. And I really didn't want to use the term immigrant, because the term immigrant in Britain, as you know, it's almost a pejorative. It has all of these negative connotations. In addition, I don't think that many of these guys intended to settle. I think that they met a girl. They were chasing a girl, and all of a sudden they realized they were caught, as a friend of mine once put it. So I think men, and this is true of migrant populations, in which, if this is a group who study migrants, that this is very characteristic of migrant populations. They tend to predominate in young men, even when they're not sailors, and they, most of them have no intention of settling down, and then suddenly they do settle down eventually because they meet a partner. So I deliberately did not use immigrants. And in my previous book, I used the term migrants because it seemed to apply to all of them. And in this case, I did kind of mischievously invert the terms native and settler a bit, which was meant to get people to think about what those categories, well, it was intended to, I don't know if it did, to get people to think about the implications of the terms. But I don't think that many of these men intended to settle until they met someone. Because there were a lot of peddlers who came with the intention of staying in Britain and peddling, and not all of them got married either. And yet they certainly came with the intention of doing work on shore. So it doesn't seem to me that's where was I going with that? So I think it was just, you fall in love, I guess. And that's why you actually get married and settle down.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So
Shayna?
oh, yeah. Okay.
Hi, good evening. My name is Sonia. Thank you, Dr. Tabili and Dr. Beliard for this lively talk. I really enjoyed it. Dr. Tabili, in your paper, you discussed the integration of colored seamen to marriage, and you spoke about their sympathetic British vibes. From the works of Dr. Ali Bhai Brown and Claire Wills, we know that these marriages were often quite problematic, and they were viewed with contempt. So do you know what were the attitudes to these mixed marriages, and did these people face prejudice in their daily lives? Did you find any evidence to that effect? And would you say that these colored seamen fared better than their other colored compatriots?
Yes, you're absolutely right. There was, the state was hostile. It seems that kind of men in the aggregate were, British men in the aggregate were hostile, at least, when there were labor troubles. And I forgot to respond to Yann. There were conflicts between men of different origins, like men from the Caribbean and Arabs, because they thought they were taking each other's, we're entitled to this job in this ship. And so there were, but to get back to your question, yes, there certainly was. And in fact, one of my points was to say that there was so much hostility and contempt, as you put it, that it makes it really difficult to find out what these relationships really were like. And it's true that some men, there were common law marriages, and that either party might not consider that to be, a real marriage. Although some marriages, of course, were solemnized, and particularly in the Muslim community under Muslim law, but they never went to the registry office to make it official. So there's discrepancies there. I do think that married men did better than men who weren't married in general, just because of the types of support that a married man got from a wife. And the fact that even if the family were upset at the beginning, oftentimes they softened. Certainly when you got married, you had to have people witness for you. You had to have two people willing to stand up for you in either a registry office marriage or a church marriage. And so witnesses were coming forward. So the couple at least had two friends, So yes, I think they, if their object was to stay in Britain and negotiate life ashore and integrate, I think they were better off with a wife than they were without a wife. The wife was giving things up, and I think the story of Mary Fazil really speaks to that she was placing herself in a precarious position. She might be voluntarily alienating herself from her family. Some people would look upon, the kind of social workers, I cut apart because I didn't have time to develop it, but this notorious Fletcher report, which some may have heard of, the social worker from the University of Liverpool did this survey of mixed families and wrote this absolutely scurrilous report. And then she didn't have time to go around to all the ports, so she asked chiefs of police. And something like 8 chiefs of police glibly stated that every wife was a prostitute, which is not true, right? So yes, the authorities took a dim view. On the other hand, the union, oddly enough, the union was hugely problematic, because one of the things about the union is they were not, in my view, they were not viscerally racist. They were opportunists. They knew better. And they manipulated racism for what they considered to be their advantage, because after a really ugly campaign against Arab sailors in 1930, someone reminded them that a lot of their members were Arabs, and that a lot of those members were married to local women, and they suddenly changed their tune kind of in the middle, and they said, oh, the married Arabs, they're fine, they're good husbands, they're good fathers, which they, by all accounts, were. So it's a deeply contradictory.
Thank you.
Right. It seems like we've reached the end of the session, but of course I wouldn't like to censor anyone. So I'm sure there's room or time for maybe one final question if anybody has one in store. But I can't see any hands raised here. So, I suppose it's time to say thank you.
Thank you.
And a round of applause from a distance to Tabili. Thank you very much for this first webinar in the series. Maybe Romain and Vincent, you'd like to tell us about the coming events?
Sure, Vincent, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, so it will be on the 15th of October, and we'll have the pleasure of actually listening to Robert Gildea from the University of Oxford, who be presented one of his latest books, whose title I do not have here, unfortunately, but you'll find it easily on the Medi blog, which I really encourage you to consult. And this will be,
the book here.
yes, Empires of the Mind.
The colonial past and the politics of the present.
Yes, so be presenting his book. So I do encourage you to be present again if you take an interest in these issues. And I would like to thank Laura very, very much for participating in this opening seminar. And Laura was accepted that the seminar should be actually recorded. So the recording will be made available shortly on our blog, right? So thanks again, and we hope to see you again and other people on the 15th of October for our next seminar, which will take place at 10 o'clock in the morning French time. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Professor Tabili. Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.